Welcome to part 11 of Buddhism, Buddhism and the Arts. This gives a brief introduction to art and architecture in Buddhism with a focus on Buddhist iconography. So a little bit about Buddhist architecture. Some of the oldest types of buildings in Buddhism were meditation halls or just halls where monks could gather and have some shelter. So, for example, when the Buddha was alive, he would often teach in apparently circular pavilions where there would be a central pillar made out of wood, and then there'd be a structure erected around that would provide shelter. And the Buddha would sit in the center with his back to the pillar and then teach to the crowd around him. This evolved into meditation halls, which are typically rectangular, where monks could gather to teach and also hear the Dharma and practice meditation. So another very characteristic type of Buddhist building is a stupa. These are burial mounds. The tradition goes back to ancient India, where kings would be buried beneath mounds of earth, often lined with stones. The Buddha's relics, or his mortal remains, are regarded as sacred objects in Buddhism. So they were buried beneath stupas, and the stupas became places of worship and centers of pilgrimage for Buddhists. There's also a custom of any being who's enlightened, like an arhat, their remains are similarly regarded as sacred relics. So when you see a stupa or another type of structure called a pagoda, these typically house relics of an awakened being. A pagoda is a form of a stupa that's actually a multi-storied tower. And you can see this mainly in East Asian countries like China, Vietnam, Korea, Japan, also in Burma, so some other countries as well. And like stupas, the pagodas will house relics. At least that was their original and traditional function. So most Buddhist monasteries will have a meditation hall. Some of them will also have pagodas or stupas as well. And it's kind of the custom to have relics in Buddhist monasteries. They're not always relics of the Buddha himself. They might be relics of other arhats or other awakened beings. So Buddhism has temples like many other religions, and the general form of a temple is going to be a rectangular hall, oftentimes with an open porch or sometimes a columned porch on one end. And they'll have on the opposite end from the entrance an altar or other sacred place. And you can see this general pattern in a lot of Buddhist temples. There'll be an entrance, and then opposite the entrance, there will be an altar with an icon of the Buddha or sometimes other sacred beings as well. The picture on the right is of a pagoda from Japan called Horyuji. And this pagoda was, this style of architecture is very closely modeled on the Chinese architecture of the Tang Dynasty, which had a big influence on East Asian religious architecture. This is an image of the footprint of the Buddha called Buddha Pada. Early in its history, Buddhism was an iconic religion. It did not use icons or images. The main exception was that they would, instead of depicting the human form of the Buddha, they would use the footprint of the Buddha as a symbol of the Dharma and a symbol of the idea that you should follow the Dharma, i.e. follow the footsteps of the Buddha to attain awakening. You can see a couple of things about this image. In the center of the palm of the foot, there's a Dharma wheel. So this was based on descriptions of the Buddha's body in the Pali Canon. There's a belief that he had Dharma wheel pattern of lines on the bottom of his feet. So that's a general way of depicting his footprint specifically. You'll also notice on the toes of this image there are swastikas. In Buddhism, as in Hinduism and Jainism, a swastika is a holy symbol which symbolizes good luck or fortune. In the context of Buddhism, it's mostly associated with the Buddha Pada or footprint of the Buddha specifically. You'll notice the Dharma wheel has 12 spokes that look like the petals of a flower. So it's a combination of the Dharma wheel symbol with the lotus flower symbol, which is a symbol of enlightenment or awakening in Buddhism. At the base of each of these feet is the threefold symbol. You have the Trisula or trident at the top, the Vajra or lightning bolt in the middle, and the Dharma wheel at the bottom. These are often paired together in traditional Buddhist imagery. The Trisula is a symbol of the triple gem, Triratna, Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha. So the Buddha, his teaching, and the order of monks who follow him. The Vajra, which is the horizontal line below the three-pointed trident, that's a symbol of the power of the Buddha's awakening. And the bottom image is another Dharma wheel. This image is from the kingdom of Gandhara in northwest India in ancient times. And this was an important Buddhist kingdom. We have a lot of our earliest images come from Gandhara. And this particular one originates from the 1st to 2nd century CE or AD. The use of footprints goes back several hundred years before this. And they were used even before images of the Buddha. So here we have an example of a complete image of the Buddha's body. This one is also from Gandhara. It dates to the 2nd century CE. Usually when you read about the history of images in Buddhism, they're first associated with Mahayana Buddhism. There's an ancient description of Mahayana which says, or there's rather an ancient description of Buddhists who worship images that's believed to be a description of an early form of Mahayana Buddhism. That would have been from around the first couple of centuries BCE. So it's believed that Mahayana started this practice, but it did spread to what's now Theravada and other types of Buddhism. So there's many different customs and conventions for depicting the Buddha. You'll notice on this ancient image, there's a halo around the Buddha. That's common for all forms of Buddhism. The use of halos in Buddhism predates that of Christian imagery and may have influenced it. It's also possible that the Buddhist halo derives from the solar disk of Greek gods like Apollo. There was Greek influence on many early iconography of Buddhism because the kingdom of Gandhara and some other kingdoms in northern and northwest India were ruled by Greek kings, and they hired Greek sculptors to produce some of these images. You can see on this particular one, we see a lot of Greek influence, not only the halo, the way the robes are depicted, the folds of them are very similar to ancient Greek sculpture. Even the way that the hair is depicted seems kind of like wavy flowing locks, similar to how the Greek god Apollo would be depicted, even though the Buddha himself was supposed to be shaven-headed. And Buddhist iconography in India eventually evolved in different ways, so the Greek influence did not necessarily persist, but you can see it in many of these early examples from Gandhara. Another aspect of Buddhist iconography is the 32 signs of the Buddha. These are described in the Pali Canon. There is a belief that a special being, someone whose birth is sort of like cosmically ordained, someone who would have either a great political or religious significance, would be born with these special signs. So a Chakravartin, one of these divinely or cosmically ordained kings whose rule will protect the Dharma, would also have these 32 signs. And when the Buddha was born with these, that's why the Brahmin astrologer who his father consulted was able to predict that the Buddha was going to have a great life, a great career. It would be either as a Chakravartin or as a Buddha. Well, I'll point out some of these 32 signs on this particular image of the Buddha. The Usnisa is a round knob on the top of his head. It looks here kind of like a bun of hair, like a man bun, but it's actually supposed to be a fleshy protrusion, and it kind of symbolizes his massive wisdom or intelligence. It's almost like a second or an outgrowth of his brain, his head. Another sign of the Buddha is the Urna, which looks here just like a little circle between the eyes. And this is kind of representing his additional vision. You could think of it as kind of like the third eye concept or an ancient version of that. Other characteristic signs of the Buddha are long earlobes. So this one in particular would have been associated with royalty in ancient India, at least from what I've read, that it was common for kings to wear heavy earrings that could kind of lengthen their earlobes. Another sign of the Buddha was the lotus flower marks on his palms. So some images of the Buddha, you can see those depicted. Another one we discussed before was the Dharma wheel marks on his feet. And there are a total of 32 such signs. You'll often see them reflected in Buddhist iconography. Here's another image of the Buddha, also from Gandhara, this one from the 2nd or 3rd century CE. It shows the Buddha reclining on his right side. This is the traditional way of depicting the Buddha at or after his parinirvana. So before the Buddha died, he became ill and had to lie on his side, and he gave a last talk to all of his monks and other followers who were gathered around him. So it's a very common event that's depicted in Buddhist iconography. Even though this is an ancient image, it's still a common theme for modern Buddhist art as well. And generally, whenever you see the Buddha depicted reclining on his side, it's a reference to the parinirvana specifically. So this is the event where the Buddha dies, and parinirvana in Buddhism is after death of an enlightened being, a being who's attained nirvana. Their consciousness does not get reincarnated into a new body. Instead, it's completely freed or liberated. And that state of being, where the consciousness is still in existence but no longer tied down to a body, is called the parinirvana. Mudras are gestures, and in the context of Buddhism, it refers to a gesture that has sacred or symbolic meaning. So this picture gives you some of the common mudras, not all of them. I'll go through a few of the most prominent ones. The Abhaya mudra is a hand face palm outwards. It means fear not, or that you're under the protection of the Buddha or some other being. The Bhumisparsha mudra is the hand gesturing down to the earth. And this is based on the ancient Indian custom that if your truth or virtue is being challenged, you can call upon the earth to witness on your behalf if you have no human witness. The Buddha made this mudra when he was challenged by Mara. Mara was trying to frighten him or arouse his lust to basically challenge his awakening. But after Mara did this, the Buddha just gestured down to the earth, which shook violently to authorize that yes, he had indeed become awakened and Mara had no power over him. Mara is a being in Buddhism who's a tempter, who tries to get people off the path to awakening. The Dharmachakra mudra is where each thumb touches each index finger on the hand, for both hands. And that creates a sort of circle that symbolizes the wheel of the Dharma, the wheel of the Buddhist teaching. This is the mudra the Buddha made when he was giving his first sutra or sermon, according to tradition, where he set the wheel of the Dharma in motion. The Dhyana mudra is where you have the thumbs touching and the four fingers of the right hand on top of those of the left hand. This is used by Buddhists when they meditate. The Karana mudra, which you can see on the bottom row of the slide, is symbolizing dispelling evil or demonic influence. I nickname it the heavy metal mudra because there's actually a connection between that sign used by modern heavy metal fans and Buddhism. It's kind of a long story, but this will probably help you remember what the mudra means, so I'll go ahead and tell it. My understanding is this gesture entered heavy metal by Dio. He was actually a singer in the heavy metal band Black Sabbath. He's of Italian descent, and I think he learned it from his grandmother, who would use it to ward off the evil eye. His grandmother was from Sicily, and Sicily basically used the same gesture used in ancient India to ward off evil. In Sicily or other parts of southern Italy, and also in Greece, they use this to ward off demonic influence. and it had the same meaning in ancient India. Um, so I think Dio just ended up using that because it was associated with the evil eye or demons, and so it seemed kind of cool. But traditionally in India, this if you gave this mudra, it would basically protect you from evil influence. And so you will see this on some Buddhist sculptures or other images. And then finally, another common mudra is namaskara, which is where the palms of both hands are pressed together. This is used as a respectful form of greeting. This is an image of Buddha Shakyamuni, the founder of Buddhism. It's a bit later than the earlier images we had seen from Gandhara. This one dates from around 850 CE. It's from India, and it's more similar to modern images of the Buddha. You'll notice that the Buddha still is shown as having curly hair, but they're kind of like tight little curls or coils. This is partly just a convention of tradition, but it's also supposed to represent, the Buddha with a shaved head, but he has a few little like small sort of like tufts of hair between shavings. That's how this is traditionally interpreted. So it's not supposed to be that literally he has long hair. You'll also notice he does have a robe, but it's very, very kind of thin. And so it accentuates just the bare features of his body. And you'll notice that even though there's kind of some similarity between this image and the earlier ones we saw from Gandhara, the customs of Greek sculpture are a bit less prominent here. So Indian religious sculpture kind of evolved in its own way over time. And this is more similar to what you would see in a modern Buddhist icon from Thailand, for example.